The winged hussars. They rode with lances over 5 meters long, segmented breastplates, and saddles so light they allowed maneuvers impossible for any heavy cavalry. Their famous wings, made of wood, leather, and eagle feathers, weren't decorative. They created a roaring vibration that spooked enemy horses and amplified the sense of speed at the moment of impact. Training involved repeated downhill charges, absolute control of the mount, and the precision to break the lance at the exact instant it pierced an enemy formation. Nothing embodies their power more than Vienna, 1683. Fewer than 3,000 hussars crashed into 40,000 entrenched Ottoman troops. A ratio so absurd that centuries later it still sounds like propaganda, yet it's documented by 3 different armies. But every avalanche meets its limit. The rise of firearms, faster loading muskets, and mobile artillery made frontal charges suicidal. And so, the unit that once thundered across Europe with feathers and steel slowly vanished, swallowed by a world where gunpowder spoke louder than cavalry. The Sacred Band of Thebes. Each soldier carried a bronze panoply fitted to the body, long doru spears with reinforced iron tips, and circular shields polished so perfectly they reflected the battlefield like mirrors. Their training was ritualistic. Synchronized marches, fixed-pair combat drills, and cohesion exercises that required each duo to fight, breathe, and advance as a single organism. Literally 2 bodies, 1 shield. That perfect fusion erupted at Leuctra, 371 BC, when 300 men shattered Sparta's elite and broke the myth of Spartan invincibility. The victory was so unlikely that ancient historians described it as a cosmic rupture, the most feared force in Greece split apart by a handful of Thebans. But even unbreakable bonds crack when facing a military genius. At Cheronea, Alexander's army, faster formations and devastating cavalry, enveloped the Thebans before they could react. And so the sacred band was annihilated to the last man, an end so absolute that the Greeks raised a stone lion to mark the place where their loyalty met eternity. The Janissaries. They were armed with Ottoman-made matchlock muskets, short Damascus steel blades, and conical helmets that dispersed impact better than most armor of their age. Training began in childhood, endless shooting drills until permanent calluses formed, tight line maneuvers, exhausting physical conditioning, and the famed martial silence, the ability to respond to commands without a single word, as if the entire regiment breathed in the same rhythm. This lethal refinement shone at Varna, 1444, when a single Janissary block halted the Polish-Hungarian advance and killed King Władysław III, collapsing the entire Christian army. The victory was so lopsided that chroniclers described it as a handful of steel holding back a sea of crosses, but no elite survives once it becomes drunk on its own power. Over time, the Janissaries resisted reforms, schemed politically, and even overthrew sultans, turning themselves into an obstacle rather than a fighting force. In 1826, the Ottoman army bombarded them inside their own barracks. The most feared corps of the East didn't fall to an external enemy. It imploded under the weight of its own glory. The Jaguar and Eagle warriors. They wore ichkahuipili, rigid, densely packed cotton armor capable of stopping bronze blades and softening the impact of arrows. The Jaguar pelts and eagle feathers weren't decorative. They marked military castes and served as visual camouflage amid the chaos. Their training demanded live capture of enemies, the central requirement for rising in rank, along with conditioning for extreme heat and mastery of the maquahuitl, the wooden sword lined with obsidian blades sharp as surgical glass. That combination produced feats that border on the unbelievable. In battles like Otumba, 1520, small detachments of elite warriors shattered Spanish formations and their indigenous allies, advancing with such speed that even conquistador chroniclers described panic. It was ritualized warfare overwhelming technologically superior troops. But no courage can defeat gunpowder, horses, and steel all at once. The arrival of firearms, epidemics, and fresh European reinforcements broke the backbone of the Aztec military system. And so the Jaguars and Eagles, once symbols of divine glory, vanished not for lack of bravery, but because their world was erased faster than any obsidian blade could strike. The Praetorian Guard. They carried high-grade alloy gladi, rectangular shields thicker than those of common legionaries, and ornate helmets that signaled rank, protection, and propaganda fused into one. Their training focused on urban combat, palace security, fighting in confined spaces, and forming human barricades strong enough to absorb direct impact without breaking. They were soldiers shaped for a war that wasn't fought in fields, but in the corridors of power. Their influence reached a historical absurdity in 193 AD, when they auctioned off the Roman throne in a public bidding war, literally putting the empire up for sale and shattering any illusion that Rome controlled its guardians. No military unit in history ever held such total power over its own government. But when a guard becomes more feared than Rome's external enemies, it turns into an internal threat. Corruption, political assassinations, and extortion made emperors realize that no ruler is safe with predators inside the palace walls. In 312 AD, after defeating them in battle, Constantine dissolved the Praetorian Guard entirely. The force that once shaped the pulse of the empire was erased, as if Rome itself were trying to forget the monster it had created. The HASHASHIN. They wielded curved Persian khanjars, crafted for silent cuts, and wore lightweight tunics that made it easy to scale walls or vanish into crowds. Their training bordered on monastic, memorizing routes, conditioning themselves to walk for days without rest, and cultivating absolute discipline to approach a target without hesitation. They learned to fight in cramped spaces, infiltrate palaces, and carry out surgical strikes without spilling a drop of blood beyond what was necessary. Their efficiency reached the impossible in the 12th century, when a handful of assassins managed to eliminate Crusader leaders and Seljuk rulers who commanded armies tens of thousands of times larger. It was the mathematics of terror executed with perfection. A few blades triggering political earthquakes. But even fear has a breaking point. The arrival of the Mongols, relentless, numerous, and indifferent to reputation, erased the psychological advantage that sustained the order of assassins. Fortresses once considered impregnable were taken as if they were made of sand. In 1256, the strongholds of Alamut fell, and the brotherhood that ruled from the shadows dissolved. Their deadly silence was swallowed by a far greater roar. The Zulu IMPIS. They carried the iconic Ikalwa, a short stabbing spear with a wide blade built for close-quarter lethality, paired with the Isilangu, a cowhide shield over a meter tall, light enough to sprint with, large enough to cover almost the entire body. Shaka's training was brutal. 31 miles marches per day, barefoot runs to harden the soles, and siege simulations that required every warrior to react instantly to the commander's signal. There were no loose formations, only a fierce herd advancing as a single living organism. This war machine reached its peak at Isandlwana, 1879, when roughly 20,000 Zulu warriors annihilated a British contingent armed with modern rifles and ample ammunition. A victory so statistically improbable that historians still treat it as a strategic riddle, so-called primitive troops overwhelming a professional imperial army. But triumph summoned a greater enemy. British reinforcements arrived with artillery, repeating rifles, and adapted tactics that neutralized the Ikalwa's reach and erased the Impis's numerical advantage. Within a few years, the force that had terrified southern Africa was shattered and absorbed, reduced to folklore by an empire that refused to tolerate rivals. The Varangian Guard. They wielded the legendary Danish two-handed axe with a broad blade and long haft, capable of cleaving through shields and bronze or steel armor with brutal ease. They wore reinforced chainmail, conical helmets with nasal guards, and heavy round shields, gear built not for agility but for raw impact. Their training was direct and savage. Repeated strikes until the arms shook, endurance to fight for hours, and a fierce discipline that demanded they never abandon the emperor, even when the world around them collapsed. Their power peaked in 1014 at the Battle of Beroia, when a Varangian detachment broke Bulgarian lines that outnumbered the Byzantines overwhelmingly. Chroniclers wrote that the Vikings opened streets of corpses, and the victory was so lopsided that the Bulgarian Tsar himself died in the chaos. But no loyalty survives the slow grind of centuries. The arrival of Norman mercenaries, changes in firearms, and Byzantium's internal instability eroded the Varangians' usefulness until they became symbol rather than strength. The Spanish Tercios. They combined pikemen wielding 4 to 6 meter spears, arquebusiers with reinforced matchlock guns, and auxiliary soldiers armed with short swords and bucklers. It was a lethal mosaic of roles, trained to move as a geometric block. Square advances, rotating ranks, staggered volleys, and anti-cavalry defenses. Their training was cold and calculated. Hours of marching in rigid patterns, practicing reloads under pressure, and cultivating the discipline to never break formation, even as the world collapsed around them. This military design achieved the impossible at Pavia, 1525, when the Tercios defeated the French army, captured King Francis Dauster himself, and annihilated a numerically superior force that included Europe's finest heavy cavalry. It was statistics being torn apart by organized gunpowder. But war evolves faster than tradition. The rise of flintlock muskets, flexible firing lines, and mobile artillery turned compact formations into perfect targets. By the end of the 17th century, the Tercios gave way to more modern armies and dissolved, taking with them the age of invincible blocks. The Kamikaze. They flew modified Zero fighters, Stripped of armor to lighten the frame, fitted with explosive charges in the nose, and simplified systems to eliminate unnecessary weight. Their training was direct, almost cruel. Low-altitude maneuvers to the point of collapse, final approach drills against naval targets, and mental conditioning meant to suppress the human instinct for survival. Each pilot received detailed instructions on impact point, descent angle, and ideal speed to maximize destruction. This extremity produced unreal numbers. At Leyte Gulf and in the operations that followed, small groups of kamikaze pilots managed to sink or damage over 50 American ships, a statistically insane achievement for attacks dependent on a single human impact against giant machines of steel. But even limitless sacrifice can't survive technological evolution. Improved radar, constant air patrols, and rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons began shooting pilots down long before they could reach the fleet. By 1945, the strategy had become obsolete. The kamikaze vanished with the empire that created them, leaving behind only the memory of a human cost no nation would dare repeat. If you've made it this far, honor granted, warrior, hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It tells the algorithm you want more forgotten battles. I'll see you next time. There's always another army waiting to be uncovered.